unceded traditional territory of the Coast Salish people, particularly the Duwamish. We thank them for our continuing use of the natural resources of their ancestral homeland. And friends, we thank you for tuning in. We know you had a choice of your evening's infotainment, and I'm pretty certain you made the right one. You already know what you're doing in November by now anyway, right? More to the point, in these challenging times, Town Hall is grateful for the opportunity to invite Seattle audiences into present tense exchanges of issues, ideas, and creativity, even when we, can't do it in person. Town Hall will continue to produce virtual content throughout this fall and into the new year, and as circumstances allow, to even host live streams from our building. Meanwhile, if Zoom or YouTube fatigue hasn't fully set in, many of our past talks are available in video or podcast form on our digital media library. Back to tonight. The program will likely run 40-ish minutes, followed by an audience Q&A. Blaise and George will select questions from those submitted in the Ask a Question field at the bottom center of the screen. We can't guarantee we'll be able to address every question, but we'll try to get to as many as possible, so please keep them concise to facilitate that. Also know that you can view the event on Crowdcast, obviously, or our YouTube page if you want to utilize YouTube's closed captioning feature. Meanwhile, Town Hall is adding new events and podcasts every day. Upcoming programs include BJ Cummings, James Rasmussen, and Paulina Lopez, discussing our unusual and undertold regional reliance on the Duwamish River. Jonathan Slate on the quest to find and save the world's largest owl, as well as events this month with Rick Perlstein and Donald Mengestu, and a future file featuring Cass Sunstein, Aaron Brockovich, Tom Hartman, Jill Lepore, Senator Sherrod Brown and Senator Chris Murphy, Michael Ian Black, and Alex Ross in conversation with the great Ann Powers, music critics going head-to-head. At any rate, you'll find plenty more about most of the above already posted online at townhallseattle.org. Town Hall's work is made possible through your support and the support of our sponsors. Our Arno Motulsky Science Series is supported by Microsoft, KUOW, the Wyncote Foundation Northwest, and the taxpayers of Washington State. But as most of you know, Town Hall is fundamentally a member-supported organization, and I want to thank all of our members watching tonight's broadcast. I'm sure this will be no surprise, but the response to COVID-19 has brought great challenges to nonprofits. Town Hall alone has cut its budget by over a third this year in an effort to navigate tough financial straits. So we're truly grateful to you for purchasing a ticket for tonight's program. If you support Town Hall's mission to make ideas and inspiration accessible to the whole community, we hope you will consider further support with a membership or by making a donation through the button at the bottom of your screen. This isn't an easy time for booksellers either, and since we know you will want to go deeper into Analogia after tonight's talk, I urge you to buy a copy of the book and to do it tonight, now, through our local independent partners, who I believe are LA Bay Book Company. Yes. Yeah, thank you. Using the button at the bottom of the screen instead of later, through one of those stateless multinational everything stores you've heard so much about. All right. After all of that, thanks for your patience. George Dyson is an historian of technology whose interests and writings have ranged from the development and redevelopment of the Aleut kayak, the evolution of digital computing and telecommunications, and abandoned efforts at space travel. A resident of Bellingham, George has lectured widely with at least 6, maybe 7 appearances at Town Hall. I consider him among our signal voices of my time here at the space. At any rate, he's contributed articles to Scientific American, Nature, Forbes, Discovered, Wired, and Make magazines. You could say he began his literary career as the subject of a book, Kenneth Brower's classic 1978 dual biography, The Starship and the Canoe, which contrasted his early years with those of his father, the physicist Freeman Dyson. But since then, he has distinguished himself as an author of Bidarka the Kayak in 1986, 1997's Darwin Among the Machines, 2002's Project Orion, the Atomic Spaceship, and Turing's Cathedral from 2012. Blaise Aguera y Arcas is a software architect and distinguished scientist at Google Research and leader of a team working on machine intelligence for mobile devices. Until 2014, Blaise was a distinguished engineer at Microsoft, and his teams over the years have investigated prototyping, machine vision, augmented reality, and wearable computing. In 2008, he was named to the MIT Technology Review TR35 as one of the top 35 innovators in the world under the age of 35. And with his three TED Talks have cumulatively received over 7 million views. And that was, whenever that was published on Wikipedia. So I'm sure it's considerably more at this point. Tonight marks the official launch of George's latest book, initially subtitled The Entangled Destinies of Nature, Human Beings, and Machines, but now called Analogia, The Emergence of Technology Beyond Programmable Control. Please join me in welcoming Blaise Aguera y Arcas and George Dyson.
Thank you.
So, George, this is an extremely personal book, and I guess I wanted to begin by asking you, and I'm sorry, I'm getting quite a lot of echo on feedback on the headset. Let me try fixing that. I wanted to just begin by asking you how the pandemic has been treating you. I mean, a lot of your book is about emergence, and we're in the middle of an emergent phenomenon at the moment. Where are you holding up? How has this worked in terms of your life, your work process, and what do you think about where we're going from here?
Yes, I feel a certain sense of guilt because the pandemic actually is treating me really well, and it's terribly unfair. I mean, sort of my life is, I feel like I'm watching two different movies. One of them is the classic disaster movie that never ends, goes on every day. It gets worse. And then the other one is a comedy called Revenge of the Self-Isolated. And suddenly, people like me who normally live a very self-sufficient, isolated life are everyone else is forced to be like we are. I mean, it's quite amazing. This book that we're here to talk about was just going into production when everyone in New York got sent home. So the entire book was produced by people working from home. So we're all sort of in the same world now, the world that I normally live in. I'm here in what used to be the walk-in cooler where kegs of beer were kept at an old tavern in Bellingham. And this is my little cave, and have the whole place to myself. And now you deal with the managers of large companies, and they're also just in their little cubbyhole in their basement somewhere. And so it's this great leveler of people. But it's unfair because for many people it's a total tragedy and disaster. My short take on the whole thing is it's a bat virus that evolved among colonial mammals living in colonies in caves, and unfortunately we behave the same way. We like to congregate in dark bars and restaurants and
social animals.
That's why it's spreading among us social primates, and we have to stop acting like bats, and we're not doing it. There's still this bar died, but there's several surviving bars that I walked past on my way home, and they're full of people now just going back to their dark caves, and it doesn't look like it's going to be over soon.
In some ways, your career has been about studying the past and the future, whether futures that we're all moving into or speculative futures that never were, as with Orion. And I guess one way of thinking about what you're saying is that that's an introvert's life in certain ways. Would it be fair to characterize you that way?
Yes, because I mean the beauty of being a historian is you should get to go back and spend time with the people you want to spend time with. You can avoid the people you don't want to spend time with. Historians have that sort of magical life where they say, well, I'm going to go spend, like Hilary Mantel, I'm going to spend 20 years with Oliver Cromwell and know him better than probably anybody did at that time. And I sort of managed to fall into a space where I have that luxury myself. I can go back and say, oh, I'm going to, and one thing I learned from my time in the wilderness was sort of one of the first rules in the, before GPS and so on. If you wanted to not get lost, you always had to look back over your shoulder at the path you took so you could find your way back. And I think history is the same way. If you actually, and you know that from your work in machine prediction, it's all about you're trying to predict a time series. You need to look backwards. That's the only way you sort of get an edge looking forward. And historians, I think, give us that. You take that 300-year backwards look, you have a better chance of not being surprised by what's going to happen in the next 10 years.
Now, if we had to predict when you were born what George Dyson would be based on the time series of of your parents and the place you came from, and the environment that you grew up in. I don't know what a machine learning algorithm might have made of that. I know that you've been asked many times about Freeman, about your father, who, for anyone who doesn't know, is one of the preeminent physicists of the 20th century. Your sister is also quite famous in Silicon Valley, Esther. But your mother is a figure that I didn't know nearly as much about until I went and did a little bit of research earlier today, Verena. And I was really interested to learn more about her story. I mean, a couple of brief biographical points. She was a group theory and formal logic specialist. She held positions at the Institute for Advanced Studies, and I was a consultant as well for Hughes Aircraft in mathematical logic and automata theory, and also for Remington Rand, the makers of the UNIVAC. And wrote a monograph on Gödel's theorem. So yes. This sounds like a pretty important influence on where you ended up going as well. So I wonder if you could tell us more about your relationship with her and how her life and career influenced yours.
Yes, and she was Swiss by background, and she was a fanatic outdoors woman, mountaineer, and took up kayaking later. And so, yeah, she was a huge influence. And of course, when she met my father, she had a PhD, but he didn't. He never got his PhD. So they were sort of effectively postdocs.
It's the same with me and Adrian. Yes. She has the PhD, I don't.
Yeah, it's fine. So yeah, I grew up in that world. But I think people think, oh, it must have been so hard to be Freeman's son. That was much easier than being Esther's little brother. We had this incredibly high performance sister, and so I was always in her shadow. And teachers expected me to be like her, and I wasn't. I think that's one of nature's just evolutionary tricks. Is you have multiple children, send them, they diversify. That helps. Of course, it has evolutionary advantage. So I took the opposite path and effectively flunked out of school, and she did great. My mother just was very rebellious and hung out with mathematical logicians who were really a strange group of people then. The computing thing was just beginning, and those were weird people, and so that introduced me to all kinds of crazy people who were just her working household. These, of course, now are sort of legends in computing because they developed the foundations of computation theory. But at the time, no one thought these people would have any real role in the real world. I mean, for someplace like, of course, Remington Rand, they were onto that, but most people weren't at that time. So my mother was very eccentric, and in a way, the chance with this book was to, most of my other books have been telling other people's stories. They're sort of driven by some story that had not been told, and I felt was unjust, that the Russians didn't get credit for what they did in Alaska, and the Aleuts didn't get credit for spending 10,000 years building these boats, and the engineers didn't get credit for computers and so on. And then finally, this book is sort of, I'm in a way telling my own story, and of course my mother is part of that.
You've described it.
George and Blaise,
when we talked earlier on the phone, as a Western. It's a book that marries two fields of inquiry that look really, really different on the surface. One of them being kayaks, tree houses, the last of the Apaches, the second Kamchatka expedition, and the other being the birth of not only the birth of computing, but the future of computing. And I wonder if you can share with us the story of how exactly those two things fit together, and what you mean when you say that it's a Western.
Yeah, it's a very very strange book. One of the first people to read it said they couldn't believe it was actually being published. I mean, not in a bad way, but just that they couldn't believe any publisher would have the imagination to actually accept this book. And that's thanks to Farrar, Straus, and Giroux. So I had these two, my life took these two very opposite directions. I spent most of my early life building kayaks and exploring the Northwest coast and being obsessed with the Russian colonization of Alaska. And that was my expertise that brought me into sort of becoming a historian, which I had no interest in. I dropped out of high school. And that just seemed one compartment of my life. And then thanks to Esther, who put on this sort of A-list conference called PC Forum and was very kind to invite my girlfriend later, my wife, Ann Yao, who was at the Seattle Times, to be the sort of the house photographer to document the sort of the birth of the personal computing industry. I got to go along just as like I was just Esther's little brother, but I got to watch this computing industry take form. And that of course brought me back to my childhood, where I had been watching the crazy, insane brilliant people that von Neumann had brought together in Princeton to build this machine. And suddenly this was all becoming real, something you could, I still actually have a Mac here that Larry Tesler gave me, an early prototype Mac. It was just so exciting to have that power that there was only one in the world in Princeton, and now somebody could give you one. Those worlds seem totally separate, but so the computing goes back to patron saint of digital computing. Some people will say it's Babbage, and of course it's Alan Turing, but if you really take it back,
or maybe Ada Lovelace.
Ada Lovelace, yes. It goes back to Leibniz, to Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, a German mathematical philosopher who really made digital computing explicit 3 centuries ago. But then when I started exploring the origins of the Kamchatka expedition, the Russians coming to America, I'm fascinated with how did we take America from the people who were here, which was a terrible crime. And it's sort of like a crime novel to go back and figure out how that crime really happened. It turns out that Peter the Great was persuaded to launch the Kamchatka expedition by Leibniz. And they sat in the hot springs together. They swore off. They were like rehab. They stopped drinking alcohol for 8 days, and they talked about digital computing and launching a voyage to America. So suddenly these two worlds of mine had been separate, were joined at that moment. And that's, of course, the opening of the book when they go to the hot springs. And for Leibniz, he was one of the people who sought power. He went to all the courts. Now, unfortunately, the rest of the European royalty, all they wanted him to do was genealogy, to sort of do mathematical proofs that they were the chosen family and that sort of thing. It was very boring. And suddenly Peter the Great was interested in science in a way that these sort of other royalty had just become bureaucrats and had no real interest in science. So it's tragic that they had only this very short relationship, and then Leibniz died.
It's a bizarre just so story, the way that Leibniz, Peter the Great, these Russian expeditions and the birth of computing came together in the figure of Leibniz. Do you think that's just a fortunate coincidence that allowed you to weave these two unlikely strands together, or do you think that there's something deeper there?
No, I think it's just I view writing as I write history, so it's truth, but you have to write it like a novel. You just have to find a story. And at the moment I saw that letter where Leibniz describes it, I thought, boy, you had your hook. Yeah, that's the opening scene. The same way as with the Turing's Cathedral book, it was going nowhere. It was just all fuzzy and nothing hanging it together till I found these letters of Clary von Neumann, of von Neumann's partner, who just wrote passionately about what was going on. And so suddenly that gave otherwise this very dry story a thread. So to shift gears for a second, you also, this book is also about a kind of dialectic, not only between analog and digital computing, but also between computing that is
in control, that's programmed in the digital sense, and that's out of control. Out of control, not in the negative sense, but in the sense of not being sort of volitional or closed in the way that a program is. And I mean, I have so many questions about that. I guess one of them is, if you're, insofar as you're positing that nature is that uncontrolled kind of computation, would you say, for example, that trees compute?
Yes, I would, of course, say that, and I've been saying that for 50 years, and most people said I was crazy, and now it's sort of not such a crazy thing to say. Trees do compute. They compute very slowly, and it may take a whole forest to, compute anything of any consequence, but they're certainly doing that kind of analog computation.
Right.
And all that, again, comes from my mother, because her specialty was formal systems, which is the field you work in, of provably exact systems, or the exact sciences, where algorithms and so on, but that can't do everything. There's things that cannot be done that way, and nature uses both ways of doing it. So my last two books were about the digital stuff. So now I'm sort of switching sides and arguing for the non-digital.
There was a really famous paper that I know you know very well, from the early 1940s by McCulloch and Pitts,
yes,
called Logical Calculus Immanent in Neural Activity, I think, something like that. It was the last paper, in my view, that really kind of posited that neural nets, that brains and logical computers and the kind of gates, computing logical functions sense, were the same, mapped onto each other. And after that, neuroscience and computer science as we know it today kind of diverged. Where neuroscience explored that non-formal logic, sort of branch of how computing worked, and computer science followed the McCulloch and Pitts model, where everything is about logic gates and adding and subtracting and arithmetic and so on. But of course, with the emergence of artificial neural nets, of course they go all the way back as well. But with the reemergence of artificial neural nets as kind of the way that AI is being done now, that it feels to me like those two branches are coming back together. So that was in the back of my mind as I was reading this book. But you really never touch on that style of computing, on artificial neural nets and everything that they've brought into the picture.
No.
How come?
Well, because that's not that I don't believe in it, but that's what everybody else is talking about. I mean, you'll find 20 books on that just in the last few years. So I've sort of avoided it. But I think it's exactly the way revolutions happen. They go in circles, and we're coming back. I was in somewhere, a year or two ago, and asked. It was some gallery thing where you had to write one statement on a Post-it note. And my statement was, perceptrons are back.
Yes.
And perceptrons were a sort of discredited model of this kind of computing, and we're back to that. So everything goes out of fashion and comes back. Of course, now we have this amazing horsepower to do things that were not realistic.
So your kind of epical theory of alternating in control and out of control kinds of computing. Do you think that goes further back in history as well? Do you think that other periods in history have that same kind of oscillation, or is this just a computing thing of the past 70 years or so?
No, I think it's true of course, you can make wild analogies with government and everything else. I mean, where the system becomes too bureaucratic, and then it phase change to something more chaotic, and then it slowly becomes more bureaucratic again. And the digital revolution is entirely real. It's not going away. We're going to have digital microprocessors are absolutely here to stay. The way the genetic alphabet of amino acids is, no matter what happens to life, that's going to stay at the core of it. And I believe it's the same with technology, but these new layers of sort of algorithmic processing are developing on top of it. And in a strange way, it's the way the infant's brain develops, these random connections, and then the networks that are useful are optimized, and other stuff is pruned, which again goes back to, we knew that in the 1940s or before. I think that's similar to what is happening with neural nets today, that we're developing these like to build a self-driving car, you need this elaborate computational structure, and I think it's just inevitable that it's going to prune itself down to where the stuff that's important for the car and the driver to survive is going to become more and more sort of analog process, because it's more robust.
Do you suppose that the falling apart of institutions, the breakdown in norms, in sort of world orders, if you like, is connected in some way to this shift from the sort of digital era to the upcoming kind of return of the analog?
Yes, but I've sort of been proven wrong. I mean, I have this way of looking at the world where whatever I see, I think, well, what if there was real AI? What would, how would it operate? And I thought, oh well, if machines were really going to take over the world, sort of human leadership would need to disappear. You'd have to have no more strong leaders, and of course we're seeing a great
era of strongmen.
Era of really bad human leadership. I mean, to where machine leadership looks really good.
Great.
That's that's what that paper by Jack Good we were talking about. It doesn't. You can make a very good case that human ethics have done really bad. I mean, humans are not that ethical. Machines could be much more ethical than humans are. But I thought the Trump thing, I thought that would be sort of like in your world, it would be a simulated annealing process where we sort of shake things up and it would settle into a better state. And of course, everything's so shaken up, we don't know what state it's going to settle into. So I'm provably wrong that my prediction was completely wrong about that.
And we're at a moment of instability where we don't know what that's going to look like.
Yeah, and dangerous instability. So.
I asked you earlier if trees compute, and I mean, of course, I knew your answer was going to be yes, and there have been a lot of books, in recent years, whether overstory and fiction or the inner life of trees. I'm actually not remembering its precise name, but about root systems and interspecies communication and between different kinds of plants and funguses and slow timescale computation in roots and so on. But what about the other question? Do you think that machines feel in their current incarnation?
No, but not in any highly evolved sense. Maybe in some. I mean, I'm again. This is just personal religion or belief. It's not particularly anything scientific. But I have this view that everything has a little bit of intelligence. I got that from Freeman, from my father. He sort of believed in that panpsychism.
Kind of a panpsychist, right?
Yeah, that every and of course he comes to that as a quantum physicist. I mean, it just looks to him like every electron in this dim way has a mind of its own. Of course, that was Leibniz. One of his great contributions was, monadology. This idea that every particle was aware of the state of every other particle. It turns out that actually is kind of true. So in that sense, and of course, it's a lot of these beliefs. The question is not whether they're right or wrong, but are they useful? And it's useful to have sort of empathy for machines. Because I spent a lot of my life working on boats and remote camps and so on, where your life depends on that outboard motor and the generator and those things. And if you have a sense or visceral sense that, that machine, wants oil, that's a good thing. It's good to in a way anthropomorphize, which of course is how people we consider primitive, of course, had that relationship with their animals, and that's important.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So if you think about anthropomorphizing, or I guess imbuing something with a sense of feeling happy, unhappy, having feelings. This car feels like it's running hot, or this speed feels a little bit too fast for this for this old Volkswagen Combi van, and you adjust your behavior accordingly. Then that's adaptive in terms of you're being able to maintain that machine. But then the obvious question is, well, what about the other way around? Are we in a state? Can we get to a state in which the machine has empathy with us and with what we wish? Are we there in some way, or are we not?
I think we are. I mean, the sort of, in a straight way, the origins of this book go back to, it was 2005 when I visited Google, just right after they went public, and after that, I wrote this essay called "Engineers' Dreams," where it became, two things became clear to me. One, that Google was actually a giant analog computer, and that the interesting stuff would be happening at the analog level, the way the brain operates.
Yeah.
And
Alex Komorowski, who is a Google employee, has described it as a slime mold.
Yes, exactly.
I think is accurate.
And then it of course, it also occurred to me that, I mean, Google was taking such great care of the people who were taking care of Google. I mean, when I went there in 2005, it was just paradise. I mean, people were, now we see the sort of sinister side of that, but at that time it was just this vibrantly happy place for the people who worked there, and which is clearly the way what machines would need to do is to take really good care of the people who take care of them. Samuel Butler wrote about that too. He's got a chapter in this book where he prophetically says, which I had missed the first time I read Samuel Butler's notes, but that he said that real AI would develop through advertising, the sort of killer. And this is 1865. He's
just a little ahead of his time.
Yeah. Advertising would be the driving force behind real AI.
Well, I guess this leads into the connection between technology or computers and capitalism, because a case that has been made, I think with some merit, is that the way in which machines are empathizing with people now, or the things that they often are optimizing for, if we think about, I don't know, social media, as being a machine, is attention, engagement.
Yes.
And if that's what the sort of emotional modeling is all about, then that has some fairly perverse consequences when you see it play out. I mean, it feels almost like the real life version of some of those singularity people who imagine like what happens if you ask the AI to make paper clips, and it makes it makes an endless number of paper clips in the process, destroying all of civilization. So what is required in order to go from these kind of simple machine models of human emotion, of maximal clicks or maximal attention or what have you, to something that works symbiotically in a way that is going to be good for our children?
Yes, that's the defining question of the moment. I mean, it's bigger than almost any of these other questions, because the danger is you get feedback loops. You get harmful feedback, like an old vacuum tube radio set. You're trying to tune it, and suddenly you go into a feedback loop. It's non-functional, and that's what's happened. I mean, that's basically the Facebook problem, and we don't know how to deal with it. I mean, it was very interesting watching the four leaders of these companies hauled before Congress, whatever it was, 2 weeks ago, and Congress wants to do something, but nobody has a clue what to do. I mean, do you break them up like AT&T? That's effectively impossible. I mean, Microsoft went through the same process in the early days, and Google was sensible enough to sort of split up organically, sort of preemptively, but nobody has a clue what to do. I mean, I think nobody knows. And
well, it seems like part of the problem is that anything that looks reductive, that looks like what James C. Scott would call seeing like a state, in other words, a prescriptive or a clear, rational way of thinking about what other thing you might optimize, will run into the same problems that really modeling goodness or progress in a human sense is one of those kind of deeply analog, ineffable kinds of things. So solving it with rules feels really hard. Like nobody knows what rule could be affected that would make that work.
It's impossible. I mean, if Gödel were still alive, he would show you that exactly. That
he would prove the impossibility of it.
Provably impossible. That if you have such a system, there is no kind of cure within the system. No, we're completely new, uncharted territory, and that is the root of a lot of what we see sort of as more local symptoms of this profound problem. It's the same. I mean, the problem with elections is simply we are now able to predict and influence how people will vote more accurately than we are able to count how they voted. The technology for counting how they voted is literally 19th century technology. It hasn't changed, but the technology for prediction is 21st century. So that's this fundamental mathematical instability. Now with the mail business, you're seeing it 10 times 10 that it's not even 19th, it's 18th century technology. I mean,
right. Babbage's penny post.
Right. I mean, counting the vote is depending on, I mean, the mail between here and Vancouver now moves slower than it did when it was horses. I mean, it's not progress.
Well, just like telephone calls work worse than they used to in the 80s when the connection was analog.
Yes.
Right, because the voice is all traveling over digital networks now.
Yeah.
So I want to ask one final question, and maybe that'll be a good transition to audience questions. To sort of tie this back to one of our original kind of points that we discussed. The theme in Westerns is justice, right? That's when all of the old Sergio Leone kind of classics are about justice and injustice.
Yes.
And your obsession with the struggles of both native people and native technologies against the incursions of the Europeans, you have more than a tinge of that. Also with honoring the inventors of the computer, Julian Bigelow and so on, in the same way as the theorists. So I wonder if this theme of justice and the problem that we were just discussing about how to actually bring about conditions that are not going to be destructive, whether those connect in your mind in some way.
Yes, they do, and that's of course that's where the book ends up. That the people who believe that they can control nature with programmable machines, it's going to turn out the other way. That the sort of nature's answer is machines whose nature is beyond programmable control. People are not as in complete control as they think, and that's not a bad thing. I believe that's a good thing. That sort of control remains in nature, and that's the world we grew up in when we, as a species, as humans, we evolved in a world where we were not the most powerful species. There were lots of animals who were bigger and stronger and more vicious than we were, and we didn't understand. We didn't have science. So there was a lot that we didn't understand. We just had to accept. And I think in a way we're moving back into that kind of world. That's sort of where AI fits in. That we're no longer necessarily the most intelligent thing on the planet. And of course, I've been comfortable with that it was like 50 years ago today. August 18th, 1970, I was 17 years old and arrived up in Johnson Strait to study killer whales. And it was immediately clear to me that they were highly intelligent, sort of a super intelligence. And so I accept that. And I think it's in a way going to be good for the world to accept that. But technically it's going to require a different, so in my view, analog will come back and we'll accept it. But it's strange that people still think this sort of analog is over and it went extinct.
But that kind of pushback that you're talking about, that blowback in the face of an attempt to rationalize, to control. I mean, I guess we could see the pandemic and climate collapse, and the waves of disinformation and the other things that are happening as a consequence of this, the social media feedback and so on, as being like the revenge.
Yeah, like sort of big analog systems that we do not have control over, and we need to be more understanding of how that works. I think it's a step forward, but we definitely are in a critical time. It's not just this one thing and then everything's going to be okay.
Yeah. Well, on that note, maybe this is a good time to switch to questions. Unless George, there is something that I haven't asked.
I think see if there's audience questions. That's great.
Blaise, this is Josh from Town Hall. Just before you do, I just want to try helping resolve your feedback issue. I understand. I assume you're still experiencing that. So I just want to
that's why I'm pulling out my earbuds.
That's fair. That's fair.
It's the analog method to solving my problem.
It's definitely it seems to be working. But do you want to just double check you don't have any other tabs with this event open? That's usually something that can cause it. Also, even the Town Hall website, we have the
testing 1 2 3. Yes. Okay. You're absolutely right. The other tab let me in and you even warned us about that ahead of time. Thank you.
Okay, great. Glad we could resolve that. But yeah, go ahead and continue with the Q&A. Sorry.
Beyond programmable control. Okay. All right. So we've got one question in what Google calls the dory, but probably crowdcast.io has a different name for it. With the ability, Freeney asks, with the ability of algorithms to focus us on specific ideas and connect us with similar people with the same focus, has technology just taken over and we are its slaves and now unable to function independently?
Well, it's tempting to just say yes, that it's terrible and it's the end of everything. But I think,
but maybe the inner question is: were we ever functioning independently?
Yes, yeah, we sort of always were. I mean, it's the way these things are so seductive because, again, we grew up as a species in these small, very local groups. I mean, the surprising thing is, like, I grew up, I mean, almost without a telephone, and you dreamed of, what if there was a machine where you could talk to anybody you wanted to talk to? I'd be talking to hundreds of people, and then you look at the real world. Probably, I haven't done the research, but probably if you stop most people, how many contacts on their phone do they really talk to? It's 12 or 15 or 20 people. It's exactly the same size as the groups we grew up in as a species talking with. But they used to be defined by geography, where you lived or something. And now, of course, with what the person asking the question is talking about, little Facebook groups and stuff, you can form these groups based on ideology, and that is one of these feedback loops where we are at great risk of being, Samuel Butler said that AI would be driven by advertising, and that people would become machine tickling aphids. Again, in 1865, he said we're going to become, and that's the danger. We just become these machine tickling aphids that give the machine the attention that they want. So,
you've also touched on the idea of time eating space, which is a Paul Virilio idea, but that both the very, very rapid cycles inherent in communication as we do it now generate feedback, and the fact that space has collapsed, and that therefore ideology or identity become the way that people form their connections. So those two things together feel like they make a resonator circuit of the kind that you were talking about, right?
Yes, and the people taking care of the machines are rewarded, and the people who are not taking care of machines are being marginalized. We're seeing that all too true. I had lunch way back with one of the founders of Facebook, who I won't name, but I asked what's the mission of Facebook, and he said, our mission is to see how much human life we can absorb.
That's really dark.
Well, it was. I mean, that was the goal. Just if you're spending 2 hours a day on Facebook, how can we get you to spend 3? And if you're spending 3, how can we get just how can we absorb human life? And they've done phenomenally successful. So,
I guess that's what the attention economy means.
yes. So,
okay, should we move to the next question?
yes.
Betty Spieth Kroll asks, my takeaway from Darwin Among the Machines, one of my all-time favorite books, that's a nice thing to hear as an author, is that evolution doesn't always move us forward, but sometimes it causes devolution. Is our symbiotic relationship with machines causing human ability to devolve?
Yes, I strongly believe that is something that we need to be afraid of. That I, of course, always use the example of just geographic location, that we, as a species, we have this amazing ability to map our territory and find our way, and we've just completely lost that. I was actually in Bellevue also 10 or 15 years ago, walking with my daughter behind some young teens. One of them was having a conversation on his cell phone and asked, what is north? Not where is north, but I mean, someone said, I'll meet you at the north side of the mall. And just, what is north? I mean, I think the statistic is less than half people can tell you where north is. And so we can just lose that ability. Now, do we replace it with something else? Do we use that empty brain circuits that used to be our geographic maps for something more remarkable? But there's a real danger of lots of species in the world have devolved. So.
I agree. There's a famous quote: "Every augmentation is an amputation." That I think puts that succinctly. But I mean, my 2 cents on this is that it's hardly new.
Yes,
we have lost as a species about a baby's fist worth of brain volume since our peak as very early humans. And there are at least some theories that hold that that's due to our sociality, and division of labor essentially
right.
has meant that while we used to all be, sort of MacGyvers, able to solve a whole bunch of different sorts of problems, we have replaced a lot of that with the ability to socialize and to divide tasks, and so collectively we accomplish much more, but individually substantially less than we might even have once been able to do when we were much more, quote unquote, primitive.
Yes, no, it's very. You can see it both ways. You can also see that we now are able to have these sort of forms of mental collaboration where we might do things that were completely impossible before. But it's a very open. Again, that's like these other questions we're talking about. We're just at this turning point where it's going to go one way or the other. We need to be careful.
There's also, I think, a pretty profound kind of inner question in what Betty is asking about human ability. I mean, I think you and I are both agreeing that at the individual level, human ability is devolving. At a collective level, perhaps not. But also, if we expand the frame even further, of is human really just about our species, or is it about all of the other domesticated species and computers and everything else? That makes up in the end, you end up with a kind of picture of the entire biosphere as
right.
something that has capabilities, right? If you take the panpsychist, or Timothy Morton has written about this kind of panpsychist view as well. So in that sense, maybe it's an upward spiral with lots of downward spirals inside.
Yes, yeah, it's really up to us. Sort of our job is to try and make the right decisions, and it becomes very specific. Like how do you raise your children? That's effectively what it is how do you let your children learn?
Do you have an answer to the how do you raise your children?
Less screen time, definitely. I mean, I grew up without television, and it shows. And I think it's just you got to let kids get out in the real world and do dangerous things, and that's what we are evolved to do. And there's a real danger of losing that. Good thing, I mean, yeah, there's something, you can take a more positive view that things like YouTube. I mean, we didn't have, if I had YouTube when I was a kid, I mean, you could learn how to do all these crazy, dangerous things on YouTube that you otherwise just might not know a kid who would tell you how to do that. So in that sense, it may be, maybe a good thing. I don't know.
I may do with a paperback copy of the Anarchist Handbook that I hid under the mattress.
Right.
All right, should we move on?
Yeah.
Let's see, Frost Keaton, and I'm going non-linearly because we're trying to honor the vote count. So yes, folks on the call should use the oops, Candace got upvoted. Okay, we're now at a tie. Now Frost is back on top. What are the key challenges to humans in the near term as we transition to an economy run by intelligent machines?
Well, there's a lot of what we've been talking about, just not to lose our individuality and not to lose all sense of social justice, which is the danger that we, one of the heroes of Darwin Among the Machines was Nils Baricelli, this crazy Italian Norwegian mathematical biologist and
inventor of a life.
Yeah, in a very real way, and just one of the kind of people I love, just absolute, crazy madman, but ahead of his time. And he argued he wrote about a lot of things. He wrote about how the moon was formed, and he turned out to be right. He was right about many things. One of the things he wrote about was that in the history of life, all social organisms have all evolved on the path like social insects, where there is a reproductive class and a worker class. And he said humans just haven't got there yet. And that you can see that as well. That's nature's solution to a problem, but it's not something we want to just walk right into. But we're heading that way now, where there is, there will be a sort of drone worker class and a reproducing governing class of a very small minority of people, and we're seeing that just economically and politically, that divergence, and it's against what we what we stand for as a country, and it's the big battle of the future. Do we and machines have a great role in that, because obviously governments that use AI are going to be more successful. It's just it has great potential, but also has great potential for sort of total regulated authoritarian society. And of course, I'm no matter whether that's good in the long run or not, I'm always going to be on the other side. I'm going to be the guy. I'm with the Apaches, the last people who, in absolute insane futility, held out against the United States Army. 38 Apaches against 5,000 soldiers.
Well, not that the Apaches were exactly hunter-gatherers, but as one looks at earlier societies, earlier in the kind of usual economic development sense, they tend to be more egalitarian and have less kind of differentiation of skills and of castes relative to more developed ones. Less division of labor, right? A little bit more like the extra fists worth of brain matter.
Right, just for the reasons you said, that they don't have. That everybody has to have the survival skills in their nuclear small group.
Right.
So
that seems like a form of nostalgia.
Yes, it's very, very nostalgic. I mean, I'm hopelessly nostalgic, and that's just the way I am. But I'm not saying it's the right thing for everybody, but it's useful to have. I mean, that's what historians do. They sort of go back. I mean, it just goes back to oral history, where there were a few people who remembered the stories and told the stories, the origin, the creation myths, and so on. But you have to go back and sort of refresh them. So, like everybody says, "Oh, we know how computing began." You say, "Well, maybe we don't know exactly how computing began. Let's tell that myth in a different way." So I'm the guy who goes back and digs out these myths, but you're free to take it or leave it.
But the deep issue that you're kind of getting at there is the question of whether we are turning into social insects. And the analogy between social insects and people is one that E.O. Wilson has certainly explored in a lot of detail, and also Mark Moffat wrote a very good book called The Human Swarm a year or two back that makes an impassioned case for using social insects as a metaphor for civilization.
Yeah, Ed Wilson's book is on the shelf right behind me. The social insects. I mean,
mine too.
they've been around for 100 million years. I mean, you can find ants 100 million years ago who have their society hasn't changed. It's hugely successful.
But it's not an egalitarian society.
No.
You talked about drones and a reproductive class, and that raises a secondary question. Sorry, Candace, we'll get to your question in a second. But it's there's actually something a little bit backward to my thinking in that picture, in the sense that birth rates. I mean, if we take reproducing class literally, birth rates among the rich are plummeting. In the world now, and just as it used to be a marker of higher status to have enough calories to be obese, now it's a marker of lower status and of being in a food desert. And having a lot of children has also become such a marker. And you can see across all of the countries in the world very clear correlations between birth rates.
Right, and so if you follow that, where it's going is you're going to have smaller and smaller numbers of richer and richer people. You're going to have the richer class is going to become exceptionally, phenomenally rich because there's less. The wealth is growing in the number of people. So on both numerator and denominator, it's becoming more extreme. And then on the other side, it's not. So that's exactly where we're headed if we're not careful.
But you can maybe also think about reproducing in multiple ways. I mean, we're talking now about children and biological reproduction. If we think instead about the reproduction of ideas or of culture, maybe that works in a somewhat different way.
Yes, yeah. I mean, there's definitely different levels, but and of course, science fiction is the place to go for me. That H.G. Wells, The Time Machine, was again about that. Exactly that same future. People have been talking about it for a long time. It's just now
the Eloy and the Morlocks.
You look at the news in the morning and you see it moving very fast.
All right, should we move on to Candace's question? She asks, it strikes me, and maybe you wouldn't agree, that where we are now is the result of the Industrial Revolution, interchangeable parts in the assembly line, etc., making people dispensable. Do you think that new tech will actually save us from that state, or is it making it worse?
Of course, I think it's making it worse, but that's because I am who I am. I mean, lots of people are making the argument that it's making it better, but I think, that's clearly or it seems to me the trend in technology is turning people into the next interchangeable parts. They're so quantified and managed, and of course, you see that with Amazon warehouse or any big operation like that. It's a very gray line between the machines and the people who are being quantified just as the machines are.
Right. I remember a conversation that I had with, of all people, Travis Kalanick, the founder of Uber, a number of years ago. I confronted him and asserted that he must be working on driverless technology. That was before it had become public, but it was so obvious that once you have boxed in the role of driving to something that is controlled, by app in terms of destination and so on from the back seat, you're one step away from just, replacing that person altogether. But I mean, let's look at the opposite side of that for a moment. The power loom, which Babbage wrote about on the economy of machinery and manufacturers, was responsible for women being able to take on a large role in the manufacture of cloth and textiles, which had previously been dominated by men because it just required a lot of muscle to move the shuttles back and forth before that became steam powered. And I actually just had a similar experience. We did a kind of nostalgic trip up and down the West Coast in the past week, and we traveled in this very nostalgic reconditioned thing from 1980.
Classic.
A classic. It lacks air conditioning, and it also lacks power steering. So, originally the idea was that Adrienne and I would split the driving time, but I ended up doing all of it because it's actually quite a lot of work to turn the damn wheel. So interchange. I mean, I guess what I'm saying is that dispensable and democratized, are sort of flip sides of the same coin, aren't they?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, you can argue that the drones in insect society are completely egalitarian. I mean, that's sort of the utopia of an egalitarian
within a
society. Yeah, but it's a matter of taste. I think you need to have both. But I'm not totally pessimistic, but I think we need to be very careful of what's happening, the path we're on.
What are good forms of automation and what are bad forms of automation in your view?
Well, there's not. The forms aren't good or bad. It's just how people use them. I mean, it's like your cell phone can be this wonderfully liberating tool, or it can preoccupy your life and be harmful. It's just how you use it. It's like any tool. I mean,
but in saying that, you're implying that it's about. I mean, this has echoes of guns don't kill, people do. It's all about individual choice. But I mean, I think you would be the first to say that there is a systems level to all of this.
Yes. Yeah.
Right. That it's not just about individual choice. There are certain tendencies. In that system.
It's how the sort of manager. How the managing class uses it too. I mean, it's also I'm terrified right now of. With the pandemic, we're going to all this online education, and that could end up really badly, or it could end up great. It could be like, my father became a mathematician because there was a war and nobody had time to, all educational structure was sort of thrown out the window and you could do whatever you wanted. And he wanted to do math. He wasn't forced to do all this other stuff. And it may be the same. There may be a lot of kids who now have this freedom to really become brilliant in something because they're not stuck being bored to death in class, but it could go the other way too.
I guess it'll go both ways, right? There'll be an injustice in this where it'll be great for kids like you and maybe not great for other sorts of kids who need that in-person engagement.
As long as it doesn't become too regulated by some companies that come in and say, oh, let us manage your online education and we'll make it all.
Enclose it.
Yeah. But so I think is that the last question?
That was the last question. Yeah.
Good.
Is there? Does anybody else want to ask one, or are we at that moment where we wind down?
I'm the grim reaper of all future conversation. Here just to wait my side. Actually, this could be our speak or for hold your peace moment. If anyone else has anything they want to pose, I'll just finish by saying that this conversation has been bracing, warm, highly personal, simultaneously optimistic and terrifying. George, I think you used the word terrifying maybe 5 times there towards the end in a way that I'm going to try. I'm going to pick up Analogia and try to carry forward the optimism that I know you actually feel, the sort of prevailing humanity's capacity to prevail that I know that you feel, despite the dimensions of this that seem to be encroaching on us. So with all of that, I'm filled with lots of gratitude. The first is to our partners at Elliott Bay, who I wish I'd remembered initially, but I'm grateful to them for supporting us in this and so many other things. And I hope you'll use that buy the book button to pick up your copy of Analogia tonight. And also, George earlier mentioned FSG for I don't want to badly paraphrase, but something about crazy and principled, or they're everything. They're exactly that. And I'm grateful to our friends at FSG for years of partnership, but especially for the courage to publish books like George's. And I'm especially grateful to Blaise and George for giving us their time this evening and sharing so much of their knowledge and their empathy with us and with each other. What a beautiful conversation that was. And finally, more than anything, I'm grateful to all of you for spending your evening with us and for getting to know more about George's ideas and to share this time with us, even in this mediated way. So thank you all so much. We will see you again. Plenty more town hall on the way. Check out townhallseattle.org for more information, and please pick up your copy of the book. Thank you all.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you, Weir, for bringing us together.